We will be looking at some of the very forward-thinking issues for the region. We will be trying to examine issues like business, economic development, and particularly young people and the challenges for the future of the region. I have a very distinguished panel, which I'm very much looking forward to hear their contributions from. Jane Kinnaman on my left, who's head of programmes at the Elders, who's a former senior research fellow and deputy head of the Middle East North Africa programme at Chatham House. To her left is Dr. Emel Badawi, who's head of research at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And finally, Donna Hodge, who's head of UK operations for the UK-Israel Tech Hub, but works in the UK and is part of the Department of Trade. So she's a serving civil servant. As with the previous sessions, all the contributions at the beginning will be on the record, and then the rest will be off the record, but you guys might want to just be fine with being on the record. You can let me know, but otherwise the presumption is it's off the record. So without further ado, I should introduce myself as well. My name's James Serene. I'm the CEO of BICOM. I'm very pleased to be doing this conference today with Rusi, and I should also just say a few words that really what this conference is about is trying to get into the detail of what Britain's Middle East strategy should be after Brexit. When we wrote the paper, we thought that Brexit would be coming soon, and we've since written a lot of papers about things happening after Brexit, and Brexit's still not happened. But at the same time, I think really this is probably the panel that really examines how Britain should be thinking about the sort of new Middle East in terms of generational change, technical change, and how we change our proposition in terms of our business relationships and what we can export into the things that we have unique things to offer, like services, education, tech, etc., rather than the sort of old school industries. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but we can certainly build on things for the future. So without further ado, I'm going to call on Emma to begin with her contribution.
Thank you, James. I kind of knew that was coming. We actually just had a conversation before the mics went on about who was going to start, and I put it on record that I wasn't because Michael convinced me I was going to be second. But you have me now, and I'm going to start this. And I think actually it might work because I don't really know what Jane's going to talk about, but I do have an idea of what Donna will, because we've been in a similar event where she may be recognising some of the thoughts I'm going to put forward to you today. And I think it will complement very nicely with what she talks about. My approach to this panel topic was very much just trying to think about if we're going to look at business innovation in the Middle East and then look at it through a prism of a generational lens and looking at the young generation within the Middle East and North Africa, there's an important question to be asked: what is it that's going to change, and what is it that this youth demographic might indicate in terms of where the future might lie for the Middle East, and then therefore our UK strategy in the region. And it struck me because there does seem to be a suggestion that there's a window of opportunity coming around the corner, or at least we're already in that window of opportunity. In April this year, UNICEF put out a report where they predicted that the most favourable period for the Middle East and North Africa will be 2018 to 2040. So in this, they actually predicted that there would be a dependency ratio of the population becoming at the lowest that it's ever been, meaning that a large proportion of the Middle East, North Africa population will transition into what they call the productive years, the most productive years in their life. And in theory, this should open up the potential for a demographic dividend, is what they call it, with increased shared wealth and expansion of opportunities for the general population in the region. And they rightly account, based on this, that 0 to 25 years is the predominant age cohort in the Middle East at the moment. And we've already had some good figures from Toby earlier today before lunch. Looking at the idea that in 2015, it was estimated that 1 in 5 of the population in the region were between the years 15 and 24, so a very young cohort. And it makes MENA the region with the largest cohort at this age bracket. So that's the tail end of the Millennial Generation, the Y generation. And Generation Z, or Gen Z is what they call it, born between 1996 and 2009. And there's a lot of interesting research going on right now about generational studies, and you'll hear lots of new theories around what it is that make millennials tick today, what it is that the next generation after and the generation after that, which is actually going to be called Generation Alpha, I think, which is 2010 onwards. So there's some really interesting studies now going on in terms of what are the mindset differences between the millennial generation and the generations before it. So the baby boomers, I forget some of the long different names that they've got, but there's a whole body of work that's being done, and it's not necessarily focusing on a particular region, it's looking at the global, broad speaking, what are the differences between generations and what they look for in their governments, in their sense of where they want to work, how they want to make themselves useful to society. And the UN predicts that this cohort has the potential to be the agents of change in MENA, in the Middle East, acting for a more prosperous and stable future and playing their part in what they quote, reaping the demographic dividend. But they say that this is only going to happen if there are certain conditions that are encouraged. And one of the things that they say is that we have to act now. And they warn that due to a rapidly growing elderly population, just as Toby mentioned earlier today, across the region, meaning that actually that's going to increase, because one thing I will also talk about, we might want to discuss later, is that there's fewer people now are actually getting married in the region, so actually the elderly population is going to grow quite substantially, and they're not necessarily then having kids, and so actually the growth of the population might slow down, even though we are talking about a steady growth in the next couple of decades. And so this window of opportunity to benefit that demographic dividend will begin to close in the second half of the century. And so it's actually, there is a time-critical moment that we're entering. And that this therefore means an urgent response, and that UK strategy would be wise to think about what it actually means in terms of how we position ourselves in the conversation of what the future of the Middle East might look like, and how can we make use of the human resources that young people today might offer. But it means that it doesn't just happen naturally. It has to be cultivated, and it has to be done through good policies. It's no doubt then that there's a general trend and interest in trying to understand what do these people actually, these young people, what do they want, what makes them tick. And actually way before the Arab Spring, there were lots of studies being done trying to understand what young Arabs think about. And I say Arabs, but obviously the Middle East are more than just Arabs. And that is probably one of the weaknesses, is that Arab Youth Survey, for example, only surveys Arabs. And so the Middle East now is more than just Arabs, and there are a lot of dominant voices of different identities that are just not being represented in any of these kind of surveys. And so do please take that with a pinch of salt. But there's obviously Arab Youth Surveys, the World Values Survey, looking at the values of large cohorts within society that are supposed to be representative, and of course there are limits to the methodologies of those surveys in terms of how representative they really might be. I can pretty much tell you that they represent the middle classes predominantly, although there are great efforts to try to represent the lower classes and the working classes, although that's increasingly very difficult. And the World Value Survey has been going for 30 years, and the idea of the World Value Survey actually was this principle since the 1980s when they started gathering that information. They noticed, or they were part of this general excitement that the world was converging because of globalization, and there was this theory that through that greater interconnectedness, generations were going to become more similar across the world, and that we would be converging on fundamental values. But actually what they found over the 30 years of collecting data every 4 years in waves is that we're not converging on fundamental values, we're polarizing on fundamental values. And so this isn't necessarily a sense that just because we're becoming more connected and able to travel and exchange ideas, and with social media now it's been certainly catalyzed, we're not necessarily becoming more similar in terms of our fundamental values. And there's an important thing, values is very different. It's a different thing to measure than, say, attitudes. Attitudes can change over time. They can be very pragmatic. Values are much more rooted, and there's a specific methodology to understand the values of a person and try to measure that. But I had a little look for the purposes of this presentation to see across the surveys what sort of trends can you pull out from the different countries in the region at the moment. And I'm going to do it really generally, so not to focus on particular countries, although I will give you one caveat that my expertise is on Egypt in the region, and that is, of course, quite a unique country in many ways, and you'll see why that actually may sway some of my insight into this a bit. So first of all, some of the top trends, and I'm going to start with the conventional ones that you hear a lot, and actually some of them Toby's already mentioned. You'll not be surprised that for many of the surveys, when asked about what their key obstacles are for the Middle East youth today, the youth respond basically summarizing geopolitical conflict, cost of living, unemployment, slow economic growth. That's not a surprise to most of us in the room, I'm sure. There's also a general excitement around the opportunity that technology and social media offers. And we tend to talk about youth as one big homogenous block, but actually, just as I said, with the generational studies going on, there's a lot of more insight actually happening around the differences across the youth. There are obviously millennials, there are Generation Z, they're not all the same, they've got slightly different mindsets and priorities. And actually within the millennial strata, people think millennials are tech savvy, but they're actually not tech savvy, they are tech dependent. And that makes them very different to being a Generation Z member of society who are actually tech dependent. But they are also tech savvy. They totally get the online world and the offline world, and they don't necessarily separate it. Whereas a millennial typically still has an online life and an offline life and needs to limit that consumption because they believe it's a hindrance to offline engagement. Generation Z are very comfortable fusing those two lives. And so the technological revolution for the Generation Z is going to be far more effective and far more natural to their development and growth than what we're seeing today with the Millennial Generation, who are still grappling with what it means to be exposed online with your views and your attitudes and how you can communicate yourself safely and smart in the online space. So we can already see the differences. The pre-millennial generation are pretty awful on the social media. It's pretty embarrassing to see it, but we know that political leaders now are entering the Twitter sphere and they're making fools of themselves. We'll see it less with the millennial generation, but we'll see it even less with Generation Z, but they'll start to see different opportunities and start to change that landscape. And in the Middle East, Twitter is popular, Facebook is popular. We've all seen it. In Saudi Arabia, research suggests that there are more than 5 million total active users on Twitter, and over 40 million YouTube viewers a day, or views, actually, not viewers. Another trend, young Arabs are now getting all their news, and actually majority of their news, so Toby mentioned this already, so it is a bit of a repeat, but the majority of their news is coming from social media. So they tend to turn to social media over TV or newspapers for their information that they're looking for. So social media is one big aspect, but also Google and other search engines. It's very natural for them to use that instead of libraries and journals, etc. This is where they're getting all their information. They're consuming knowledge through that engine. And so technology is quite rapidly revolutionizing the way that information is being spread and consumed across the region. And that is actually worrying the governments, as you can imagine. Governments that are very used to regulating that kind of thing and dominating and controlling the national narrative. Nearly 50% of men in the region between 25 and 29 are unmarried. So that's actually linked to economic and cost of living issues and unemployment and underemployment. But it's also connected to actually very deep cultural challenges that the region's facing, where the generation of their parents is squeezing the generation that we're seeing today that should be getting married and building families. Where there's certain expectations on them that they don't necessarily meet. They see Western lifestyles. It doesn't necessarily reflect their lifestyles. There's a lot of cultural factors involved in that. But basically, there's an entire generation that don't feel like they're ticking boxes. And actually, that's an interesting one for the millennials because there's a bit of a split now happening with the millennial generation where you've got half of the millennial generation essentially are the ones that they've been taught to just follow the system, get educated, earn a living, get married, have kids. That's the way you do things, and that's how you succeed in life. And that's living a full life. The other half are not doing that and actually quite consciously deciding not to live that life, partly because they necessarily can't, but also because they might be consciously against it. And actually, many of the second half are the typical ones that were on Tahrir Square, out there tweeting about social reform in their country and thinking about those self-actualization values that we were watching in 2011. Those that just thought, you know what, this system isn't working. This social contract that I've inherited from my parents' generation isn't working for me. It didn't work for them, so I want something different. And there's actually a split, and it actually means that millennials are hating each other because some of them are the ones that are just getting on with life and trying to tick boxes that they were conditioned to tick, and the other half are sort of living a slightly different life where they just aren't satisfied with the status quo, and they don't necessarily see eye to eye, and so they're not, even within the millennial generation, they're not the same. Nearly 50% of men in the region, I've just repeated that, sorry. Arab youth struggle, and this is quite an interesting one because it's one that doesn't necessarily come up in conventional conversation, but Arab youth are actually struggling with religious values and institutions, and they're trapped. They see them as being trapped in the past. And that's one that I picked up from the Arab Youth Survey, and it keeps coming up. But they actually talk about how religious institutions are alienating young people. And it's not that they want secular societies necessarily, and a lot of people read the data as if there is a rise of secularization in the region. And that would be a slightly misleading way of doing that. It's more that they want religion and they respect religion in their culture and in their everyday life, but they want it in the private space. Or they look at the religious institutions as being out of touch with their everyday demands and issues. They don't see them as being independent or representative of the religion or the Islam that they want to practice. And what that's meaning is that it's starting to weaken the ability for religious leaders to be key community levers for government and for civil society. Some more less conventional, under-discussed trends. Relations between Shia and Sunni youth apparently are getting worse. I do have a couple of issues with that data, and I think you should look at it rather critically because of where it's come from. It has come from a Gulf-funded survey. But it's generally suggesting that post-2003 generation seem to be a lot more hyper-aware of their sectarian identity. And the actual incidences of Sufi marriages, Sunni Shia marriages, has really reduced, which suggests that there might be some sort of shift happening in terms of, in the absence of other identities being put forward, more narrow identities are taking a larger form. And actually that relates to another conversation that is an interesting one around thinking about grand strategy and world order. One thing I have noticed from not just the surveys that come up, where there does seem to be a strong emphasis on a rise of nationalist identity in the region, but also from my own fieldwork in 2013, which albeit is quite a unique period of time, very soon after the Arab uprisings, there does seem to be a rise of nationalist identity. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's anti-Western, but there's something that we have to bear in mind when we think about UK strategy. It is not necessarily, we're not witnessing an entire generation that's just going to be reform-minded in the sense of being cosmopolitan, global-minded. I think it's putting a lot of pressure on a generation to shed the skin of the past, of generations and decades of national narratives. And those national narratives still exist in everyday parlance in the region. And young people still talk about Egyptian identity. They still talk about Palestinian identity. They still talk about Jordanian identities. And it's something that I think we tend to ignore when we engage in the region, because we think that just because, actually, I mean, most people talk about world order today, they talk about rise of nationalism, broadly speaking, whether it's through populism or less populist variations. But at the individual level, let's forget the sort of very state-centric approach that we tend to have when we talk about world order. At the individual level, there is definitely something happening with identities and how people want to define themselves. And national identity is still incredibly strong. A lot of research is being done at the moment into that sort of the importance of national identities. I don't think we fully have embraced what that might mean for a future Middle East, especially in the absence of alternative visions for the future. And this is despite the fact that actually the new generations are very diverse, and they see huge importance to big issues like anti-racism. So, for example, Generation Z will never have known a world where the US didn't have a black president. They just will never understand a world that didn't happen. But at the same time, the Millennial Generation has never known a world before 9/11. So life before 9/11 didn't necessarily have Islam at the spotlight of the conversation, and Islamic identity being seen as the source of deep conflict. But after 9/11, that's definitely been a major theme in global engagement around religion and the Middle East, and trying to sort of understanding how Islam has been put on the spotlight and criticized as a really big one for many Muslim majority countries, where they feel like people talk about their identity and a big primary identity of theirs, but it's not necessarily represented in the way that they live it. And that's definitely something that the Millennial Generation is quite unique about, and certainly it exacerbates after you get even more generations after it. So essentially, just to sum up, that national and Arab identity does seem to be still quite a dominant feature in a lot of the surveys, but I can also confirm that in my own interviews that I did around 2013, where actually I found, despite having been educated in international British or American schools in Egypt, Egyptian nationals who went to international schools, they actually showed signs of more nationalism than interviews when compared to Egyptian nationals who went to Egyptian national schools. So even education that's supposed to be internationally minded wasn't making a huge amount of difference to the values of young people today. And that brings me to another point, which is, don't assume that just because you have soft power, Britain, that you are going to be able to influence the way people form their values. Just because they're buying Nike caps, paying for iPads, and wearing Western clothes doesn't mean that they have done away with their traditional family values. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an anti-West set of values. And I think it's just trying to get comfortable with the fact that when we're trying to think about what values young Middle Easterns have, be comfortable with the fact that they might be contradictions in themselves. They might be a little bit anti-Western, they might be a little bit anti-British, but they also might love Britain because it offers really interesting lifestyles and they want to go and travel there. That's something that we don't tend to have a very comfortable space of understanding contradictions in people's values systems. Another one that I would share as well, if I've still got the time, there's a sort of conscious attitude among the current leadership within Al-Azhar at the moment that Egyptian young people, they also said Jordanian, are losing their understanding of the importance of the Palestinian issue for today. So when we're talking in the previous panel about the importance of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, at least within the region right now, there is some constituencies and the leaders of those constituencies that are concerned about an apathy that's rising around the Palestinian issue. And Al-Azhar, in the recent Cairo book fair, decided to actually address this as their main theme, and they called it the Year of Jerusalem, 2018, the Year of Jerusalem. And obviously that was after the Trump decision to base the embassy there. And it was based around Al-Azhar's leading sheikh, and he said basically that our youth barely know anything about the historical status of Jerusalem and the importance of the whole cause to our present, unlike the Zionist settlers who bring up their children to hate Arabs and fill them with historically false ideologies and concepts. And this is something that they clearly felt that there's a missing element within young Arabs today that are not aware of their identity and Egypt's role in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And therefore, us not engaging with it as a democratic, pro-Western liberal, rules-based country just means that other people will form some sort of leadership within a vacuum of conversation. And there's mobilization still happening in some interesting areas. But it's an indication, at least from within, that there's a few things that there's a generational shift in terms of interest in big conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are some positive things that I think is quite useful to bear in mind around technology. The internet and some really successful entrepreneurial stories have really inspired generations, and I think Donna will have much more to say about some success stories in the entrepreneurial space. But these people are actually the ones that are the role models for young people today in the Middle East. So people who, for example, the entrepreneurs who recently sold Souk.com, which was basically the Amazon of the Arab world, or Careem, which is the Dubai-based Uber, that was just recently purchased by Uber, in fact. These were the founders that, for them, they're the ones that broke through the system and succeeded despite the fact that it's not easy to break through the system and succeed and become a prominent figure and make a lot of money. And actually, Fadi Ghandour, who's an Arab entrepreneur, he recently said, there is no wasta on the internet. And that actually really encapsulates how the internet and the technological revolution is seen as a real opportunity for young people to actually break free. Because whereas previous generations looked at governments as the dominant provider for giving you jobs and letting you have money, Today, they're actually starting to get a little bit of an idea that they could be entrepreneurs and don't necessarily need the government to help them get a job and get them earning a living. And it's these kind of role models that they're looking at, and they're really and it's amazing to see how people react to some of those stories. At the moment, there are some interesting Egyptian startups tackling some big issues, for example, traffic. So there's a new startup called Ba'ulak, which is dealing with traffic jams in Egypt at the moment, and it's attracting some real attention by young people because this is their everyday life. This is the stuff that they're so sick and tired of, and they're embarrassed by. They're embarrassed when they look at their country and they think, why have we got this problem? We have the innovative ideas that we can fix it, but we just don't have the support and the resources from governments, from the international community to fix it. But these people are breaking through the system. Another role model that you'll all be aware of, Mo Salah. He has been an international sensation and a particular area of pride for Egyptians. But it's interesting because you look at some of these examples like Mo Salah, who enters into the international community and he breaks through, but he's often then seen as, he gets taken by the Egyptian government, for example, as an example that the system's not broken, that you can still succeed as an Egyptian, and look how great the Egyptian generations are. But Mo Salah he achieved what he achieved not because of the system. It was in spite of the system that he achieved it. But once he's in this prominent space, he's suddenly seen as this example to sort of say, look, everything's great. If Mo Salah can do it, then you can do it. And it's all this kind of, it's frustrating because these people then become tools for politics, because then they have such a prominence and they're used by political leaders to further an agenda or to support an agenda. But if they don't do that, then they get themselves in trouble, and they're put in a situation where they've achieved their success in spite of everything, but then they're suddenly then leveraged for different things. And I think people can see that now, and you can see that with Mo Salah. It's a real shame to see people seeing his rise, but then seeing how he's being, and he's doing a good job actually to try and resist it, but seeing how he's being slightly manipulated to be or if he doesn't play the system, he might then get seen as we can discuss it later, but when it's off the record. But so in a sense, there are a lot of opportunities there, and I think it's the entrepreneurial aspect and the startup and the gig economy that's exciting people, because they can break through the system in their head that it's the one area where they don't necessarily have to have wasta to get what they need. But in reality, business is difficult. It's heavily regulated. To actually get a startup going, to actually get the investment you need, it's not easy. And so we can talk about all the opportunities, but we have to also be realistic that the structures around innovating in business is not easy and it's not helping people. To sum up, one thing is definitely for sure, right? 16-year-olds today in Jordan or Kuwait or Israel have more in common with 16-year-olds in Egypt, Lebanon, Bahrain, Iraq, than they do with 65-year-olds in their own countries. And we can form policies that recognize that. It doesn't have to be our policy towards Egypt, our policy towards Jordan, etc. And there's real value then in analysing the future of the region through that intergenerational lens, because you start to look beyond the boundaries that we've set ourselves. But the conversations of generational friction change can often be quite misleading. There's this assumption that older generations that assume that the new generations are always reform-minded. They're more modern, they'll be more liberal, they'll fix everything, and it's not fair, because if you can't assume that's going to happen unless you invest in it and you cultivate it. And can we really expect one generation to shed the skin of decades of instability, of corruption, of wars, of economic struggle, and long-term breach of a social contract that hasn't delivered at all? People just don't believe in a rules-based system in the region. This idea of working hard, reaping benefits, and doing well, it's not a guarantee. And so actually, when you see these success stories emerging, it's in spite of actually what's available to them. And people haven't seen the value necessarily of an Egypt, of a Syria, of an Iraq that opened up to the world. 1970s Egypt, you didn't necessarily, the generation doesn't look back and think, oh, I saw the value of being plugged into the global economy. This idea that I'm now part of the transnational elite. That's not a reality for the average Egyptian anymore, or ever was. And so while the demands for the Arabs, young Arabs today and Middle Easterns today are actually not particularly radical or revolutionary, it doesn't necessarily mean that our policies shouldn't actually be quite radical and revolutionary. We can't think that we can actually fix this if we just carry on the way we are, thinking about it from very high-level, state-centric lenses. You've got to think about the individual and how can we help the talent that's in the region. I've got more, but I'm actually going to stop now because I think we can draw it all out in the discussion.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of nuggets there to think about and reflect on in the Q&A, and helps us sort of understand some of the issues we're trying to deal with. I'm going to hand over to Jane now.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Iman for that comprehensive overview. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more on the issue of young people in business, and what is the situation like for entrepreneurs, particularly in the Arab world, which is where most of my research has focused. I'll quickly note I work for the Elders, which is a group of independent global leaders who work on issues of peace and human rights around the world, but I'm speaking about my personal views based on my research in the Middle East and previous experience as an economist and business consultant working there. And of course, the Middle East is an area of great economic diversity. So the challenges that are facing entrepreneurs are, of course, very different in the wealthy countries of the Gulf, where a lot of the policy concerns are about voluntary unemployment and how to wean people off the traditions of dependence on a state, which in some countries has been able to provide quite a cushy lifestyle, and where typically most of the private sector work is done by foreigners who are kind of permanently present outsiders, working for much lower wages and worse working conditions than the nationals. And that's obviously a very different situation than the kinds of concerns about youth unemployment that you'd have in a vast country like Egypt, where you have 700 or 800,000 new entrants to the job market each year, and a real difficulty even keeping unemployment constant, let alone making a dent in it. And then you'll have countries like Lebanon, where there'll be a mix of the super rich type of people you might see in the Gulf and the extremely poor that you might see in Egypt existing within one tiny country. And I'm afraid I am going to generalise a bit about this very diverse region, because I think we do see right across the Arab world that there is a huge pent-up energy and creativity among young people that could be a great force for economic development if it was given more opportunity. But in most of the countries, although they vary, there is a serious lack of an ecosystem to support young people who want to go into business, in terms of the regulation, the availability of credit, and the social and cultural support for entrepreneurship. And it's funny that, I guess I've been looking at this region for about 16 years now. Many of you have been much longer. But it always seems to be something you can predict at any conference about the region's economy. People will say, and we must support small and medium enterprises. And it's a little bit like people saying, we must, of course, not forget the Palestinian issue just before they forget it. It's always raised, but not very much is done. And it seems odd, because from an economic policy point of view, in most economies, small and medium enterprises provide most jobs. So if you're wanting to create jobs, you want to create good conditions for small and medium enterprises. But we do have, to varying degrees across the region, big issues of crony capitalism and quite significant vested interests in having a very concentrated business sector, where typically you have, a small number of important state or sometimes royally owned enterprises and a small number of big business families, often partnering up with big global brands, and then a really large number of tiny enterprises that employ less than 10 people. And you have a problem that's sometimes called the missing middle, where those small enterprises can't scale up, they can't become formalised, they can't grow. And that very much feeds into, the attitude and thinking that you were talking about, Iman, about people not feeling that there's a kind of necessarily a just rules-based system that will work for them. And this was made very, very obvious in the 2011 uprising as one of the key refrains of youth right across the region, this sense that there was corruption and nepotism everywhere. And it was interesting, that educated young people were particularly well represented among protesters. And the more educated the young people are in most of the countries, the less likely they are to be employed. And there's a big frustration and mismatch between the expectations of what people should be able to achieve and what they can achieve. Obviously, those uprisings were a wake-up call to governments, and you have seen a variety of governments try to shift the balance and take on some of the vested interests and create more opportunities for youth. But it remains a difficulty, right across the region. And it's been sort of interesting to see talking to young people, particularly in the Gulf countries, where people tend to think a lot about state dominance of the economy. But there is quite a lot of evidence that young people increasingly see the business elite as more of an obstacle to them than they do the governments. That there are certain bits of the economy that are run by the private sector, but very often, if you look across the Gulf states, they are run by family conglomerates, and the names of those families are the names that you'll find in kind of British colonial history books from the time before oil. The people that were successful merchants 100 years ago are still the people dominating the private sector today. And of course, many of them are very astute and very successful business people, but they're not necessarily encouraging new entrants or people who can innovate. So, for instance, when it comes to, there is a really big attitude change among young people when it comes to climate change, just like there is in the rest of the world, even though if you look at Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, they are still countries that will stand up at the UN and sort of act to block key climate change resolutions from time to time. But young people are becoming more and more aware of, actually solar could be a huge opportunity for us. What about biofuels? There have been some instances in Dubai of small innovative SMEs working on some of these things, but generally there's sort of no regulation, there's no ability to set things up. Sectors are sort of so heavily over-regulated and not regulated in a way that is there to encourage experimentation and creativity, that it is quite a big barrier. Of course, you are seeing a driver for change in the Gulf countries because of concerns about oil running out or oil prices being lower for longer, perhaps when the immediate political risk around the Gulf dissipates. But I think this is somewhere where the UK can be very helpful to young people, but also very helpful in advocating with governments and in having sometimes quite frank conversations about the political economy of all this, that it's not, sometimes people misperceive it that this region is lacking entrepreneurs because they don't have the same values as us and it's all a work ethic issue. It's much more to do with incentives and the rewards versus the barriers that people see around them. And there's a huge amount more that governments could be doing to make it easier for young people to enter the market and less dangerous for them to fail. That's obviously a big issue you hear about a lot from young people, is the huge kind of societal fear of failure, the sense that it's much easier to go and do a job like your dad did in the civil service rather than starting your own thing with the shame that might come if you were seen as getting that wrong. And there are kind of now beginning to be role models emerge. Fadi Ghandour, who you mentioned, is a very important one. There's a fabulous kind of website and network called WAMDA, which is a platform for young entrepreneurs across the region and seeks to bring people together. But the founder of that went to the US to start his first business, and he will say that he had to go and be a success in the US before he could come home to Lebanon and be seen as a success by his parents there. So I think this is definitely a good area that the UK can sort of fruitfully pursue, this being a country where it is pretty easy to set up a business. But there are other areas around young people, entrepreneurs, and changing technology that I think raise quite a lot of concerns about this core issue that Iman kept coming back to of the social contract. Because what we are seeing globally is a lot of concerns about the future of social protection for young people. Globally, youth unemployment is almost twice as high as unemployment among adults. And we are seeing this rise in a gig economy. We're seeing a rise in international outsourcing and, employers taking less responsibility for the social protection of their employees, even as governments have very, very limited space to provide that social protection. And again, we see at a global level challenges that we don't yet fully understand or know how will evolve, coming from artificial intelligence and automation. Potentially, things that can save people a lot of mundane tasks and make people more productive, but also we are already seeing technological change making people's skills obsolete and making people redundant. And the logic of that is a need for greater social protection and greater lifelong investment in education and skills and training. But how is that funded? Where is that coming from? And I think we need to be very careful in the UK that we don't simply advise governments in the Arab world who may have overall an unsustainable role for the state in the economy, that we don't give them a sort of simplistic view of just rolling back the role of the state and the private sector always being better. I have noticed that from time to time, that you might have people from the Middle East come and visit, say, the City of London and have a tour and hear all about the great successes Britain has had with privatisation, without really getting a full picture of how privatisations have varied a lot from sector to sector and case to case, and how privatisation of something like the rail networks is still something that we debate here. One of the technologies that I think will be most important for the region, but I really can't pretend to know too much about it, is blockchain and the kind of advances that are coming up in financing technology, because I guess the final big issue to mention that young entrepreneurs complain of is that it's so difficult to get credit. The financial sector in the Middle East is pretty underdeveloped. Banks are very often either lending to government or lending to big families where they feel pretty confident that they know their customer. And the kind of angel investing is extremely underdeveloped. Investors find it very difficult, I think, to assess the kind of risks of investing in new businesses. People don't often have the skills to pitch themselves properly. But once you get to financial technologies where know your customer is deeply built in and verifiable, that's something that sounds to me like it could be quite revolutionary for entrepreneurs in the region, if only I truly understood how blockchain worked. I'll just finally respond on a couple of the points that Iman raised, that I think governments have been, very challenged by the way that young people have become so both tech savvy and tech dependent and so active in the cybersphere. But I think at the moment governments are winning in terms of how they extend social control onto social media. And I think that they have been very successful in harnessing a kind of quite aggressive form of nationalism, even in countries like the Gulf countries where nation states are relatively young. And you suddenly see, for instance, Emiratis and Qataris pitted against each other on the basis of a very strongly felt national identity, when they may literally be cousins, they may literally be parts of the same family. And 5 years ago, they did not feel that same kind of sentiment. So I think we also have to be very cautious. This has come up particularly, around issues of export of surveillance tools, such as by NSO Group, tools that appeared on the phones of associates and friends of Jamal Khashoggi, and there are various court cases associated to that. But these issues have come up before with other groups exporting to places like Bahrain, where surveillance technology manufactured in Western countries has been used to sort of against populations rather than against criminals and terrorists and so forth. I think there's a huge amount of useful kind of outreach that policymakers can do when it comes to social media, but when it comes to the whole field of cybersecurity, cooperation with governments in this part of the world, I think there needs to be a lot more transparency and a lot more regulation of some of the things that are going on in that space. I'll wrap up there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Donna from the UK Israel Tech Hub, who's going to give us an overview of some of these tech possibilities with the example of the UK Israel Tech Hub and maybe also explain blockchain to the audience.
Yes.
No pressure.
So we talked a lot in the previous panels about how the UK can create a structure that embraces a new digital strategy, which is more aligned with the changes of the region. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the UK Israel Tech Hub as a use case, as a case study, and also talk about recent development and also how Arab countries could be part of this story. So for those who don't know the UK Israel Tech Hub, the UK Israel Tech Hub is an innovative UK government team based between the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sports in Whitehall and the British Embassy in Tel Aviv. It was set up 6 years ago by Number 10, by former Prime Minister David Cameron and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, with the goal to build strong tech ties between the two countries. So you might ask the question why, what's unique about this model? There's already existing trade ties between the two countries. But what's unique about this model is that from the beginning, it thrived to find new ways of commercial diplomacy, which goes beyond the export and import models that we all know. So it's not really about selling to each other. Israel is a very small country. I'm not sure how it can contribute to the UK in terms of market, but it's more about finding these win-win partnerships, finding these synergies, and finding where the two countries could complement each other. So we're basically a 12-people team based between DCMS and the British Embassy, as I said, and what we do on a daily basis is we help UK corporates tap into the best innovation coming out of Israel, but we also help position the UK as a partner of choice for the most cutting-edge Israeli startups, where they would usually, I would say, choose the US or Asia as their first destination to grow and expand. And so in terms of why Israel, why did the UK choose Israel? I'm not taking for granted that people here know about Israel's tech advancements. So in terms of Israel, Israel is an innovation powerhouse, has been for around 30 years and still going strong. It's the second biggest supplier in innovation in the world after the US. And it has special expertise in defense and cybersecurity that most of you might know, but also it has a very unique expertise in AI, in computer vision, augmented reality, blockchain, and so on. So it has a lot to offer in terms of from an international perspective to other countries. 5% of the GDP in Israel is spent on R&D, more than any other country in the world, including the OECD or others. It has the highest startup per capita after the US. In Israel, you have 4,000 active startups and 40,000 people working in the tech sector. Also, Israeli tech raises 2.5 more investment from VC money than the US and 30 times more than Europe, of course, per capita. So this didn't happen just out of nowhere. So the government had to take active measures in order to get to that level. So I would say the defining moment was around the Russian immigration in the 1980s, where the Israeli government had to provide jobs and a landing pad for these engineers, doctors, and researchers coming from Russia. And it started a scheme around tax incentives where it encouraged investors, traditional investors and traditional factories to invest in tech and provide jobs for engineers in return of tax incentives. So a traditional plastic factory that never even looked at tech before, now it's in own favor to hire engineers to start working on R&D and developing new innovative products. So this is how it mainly started. And of course, we can't deny the mandatory service, the military mandatory service, where it offers and provides a lot of expertise for young Israelis from leadership skills, but also in terms of solving complex problems that other people in their generation and other places in the world don't. So it definitely gave Israelis an advancement there. So, of course, other countries and international communities have identified this potential, and as a result has developed, together with the Israeli government, all kind of policy incentives where it would encourage UK multinationals to come to Israel and set up R&D centers. So as of now, Israel has 350 multinationals based in Israel doing R&D work and working on their most cutting-edge products. And of course, that's a loop that also, I would say, complements to the expertise in Israel, but also adds more expertise and adds more specialties. But that wasn't the case in terms of if we look at multinationals and countries that are active in Israel and benefiting from what Israel has to offer. I wouldn't say that 6 years ago, the UK was part of the story. And so when we started the UK-Israel Tech Hub, we wanted to help the UK to be in the forefront of this. And in order to do so, we looked at synergies where the UK market could complement the Israeli market and the Israeli market could complement the UK market. And we found, of course, synergies in cybersecurity, in fintech, in smart cities, in retail, and in Arabic online content. So we've seen a lot of successes in connecting UK banks, such as the RBS, such as BC and Barclays, to innovative fintech and cyber security startups from Israel, where we reached to the level where 8 out of the leading 10 banks based in the UK are protected by Israeli technologies. Most of these banks also have chosen to open an R&D presence in Israel in order, and that happened only in the past 2 years, in order to be ahead of the curve in sourcing the best innovation, because if they don't do so, others will do it and other banks will do it. We've also seen a lot of successes in the area of smart cities. So we worked with telecom, energy, and transport companies here in the UK, and we've connected them with automotive and smart mobility solutions and AI solutions coming out of Israel in order to help create a more advanced smart city proposition in the UK that could act as a model and as a benchmark for other cities around the world. We also looked a bit further and in a bit, I would say, more creative way in terms of positioning the UK as a bridge for Arab-Israeli entrepreneurs. So I'm not sure how much of you know about Arab Israelis in Israel. I'm an Arab Israeli myself, and we consist 20% of the population in Israel. And despite the fact that we're very educated, 50% of the population is educated, and 50% within that is women, but we're not fully integrated in the tech ecosystem for a lot of social and political reasons. It's improving, definitely, it's happening, but we're not really part of the, I would say, Tel Aviv tech cluster that you all know about. But we wanted to help solve that gap by positioning the UK as a bridge for the MENA region. So we worked with Arab entrepreneurs in Israel who are developing solutions in Arabic in their domestic market, but have the MENA region in there as a fantasy in the back of their mind because they cannot access it. So we worked with UK companies in order to create that bridge. And we've seen a lot of successes very fast, more than we expected. And we profiled a lot of these stories. And also, I would say one of the recent things that happened as a result, I would say, I don't know, I wouldn't want to say a direct result, maybe an indirect result, but the Saudi government has recently, in a very innovative scheme, in an innovative way, it offered a new visa scheme for Arab Israelis to come to Saudi and set up businesses and startups and receive investment from the Saudi community, something that was out of reach. As an Israeli Arab, you know Saudi only if you're religious and you're going to Mecca. But other than that, you would never dream about going there and working. So that would definitely work. It will open a whole new door of opportunities. So as a result of this work, we have, of course, an economic value that we can demonstrate, and we've done in our recent impact report. And our recent impact report showed that our work in the past 6 years has brought an £800 million value to the UK economy. So that untraditional model of trade brought, a good value, and £100 million in commercial value in terms of the UK corporates that were involved. As a result, 335 Israeli startups set up in the UK. 30 out of them are listed in the London Stock Exchange. So, of course, contributing in the same time to themselves, but to the UK economy. And the recent success that we've seen in this model, in Theresa May's recent announcement, and replicating our model globally. So now we're no longer only a UK-Israel tech hub, a pilot that the UK government is proud of, but we're more a network of tech hubs. So now, as of March 2018, we're now a network of tech hub where we have a UK South Africa tech hub, a UK Kenya tech hub, a UK Nigeria tech hub, India, and Brazil. And of course, Israel, part of this network, and it plays a dominant role, but also we want to achieve a network effect where we can work with the UK could work with each of these countries, but also each country could work with the rest of the countries. So a proper network effect that we want to create. And this is a model that didn't exist before. And if we take the short time that we were able to achieve this, I would say that the UK did take a risk, and it really worked. So in terms of where we're looking next, so of course there's endless business opportunities. We can talk about fintech and cyber between UK and Israel, till next year. But if we want to look at more strategic models, and we want to look more about impact and how can UK-Israel tech ties break barriers, how can it improve the lives of the next generation, and we want to also look at models how UK-Israel tech collaboration could also, and others, could change the face of the region. So in terms of things that we're looking at, we're looking at drone technologies, Israeli drone technologies, and matching that with pharma companies here in the UK in order to improve healthcare access in remote areas. We're also looking at connecting smart mobility startups from Israel, automotive startups, driverless car startups together with car manufacturers in the UK and OEMs in order to solve some of the traffic and congestion problems in Africa and in the MENA region. And also, we're looking to help solve the unbanked problem, the unbanked crisis, which Jane talked about, which is basically people, the unbanked population is basically people that have no access to financial services due to lack of credit. And just to give you an indication, 60% of sub-Saharan Africa is unbanked, and 30% of the MENA region is unbanked, and mainly women and underrepresented community. So we believe that the financial industry here in the UK, together with the fintech community in Israel, mostly with blockchain, could definitely improve that picture. And we're also looking at water development projects where the UK plays the dominant role in bringing Palestinian companies, Israeli companies, and Jordanian companies to improve water resources in the region. So there's definitely a lot of things that we need to do. And In terms of, what else, what the UK could do, what's the lesson learned here? Of course, Brexit is an opportunity, without sounding cliche, but Brexit, it is an opportunity to look for new trade partners as well and look beyond what we had in front of us for the past few years. So it definitely also applies in tech, and I believe personally that the UK needs to look beyond as I said, the classic models of trade and look for these tech clusters and identify trends and identify synergies and less focus on import and export. So the same for the MENA region. So there is an urgency, I believe, that, in terms of how the UK is looking at the MENA region as a partner, as a tech partner. And there's a lot of trends that are happening in the MENA region that I'm not sure how much the UK integrates that in its digital strategy. So I'm also personally not a big fan of the one-sided approach where the UK takes, or any other country takes without giving. I believe in win-win partnerships. And tech is all about win-win partnerships. It's about taking risks. It's about investing. It's about long-term approaches. It's less about selling to each other. And so if we want to take a look at the MENA region, just to zoom in a bit on what's happening in the MENA region. So there are a lot of trends and advancement that are happening in tech that we're seeing in the past few years. Both Iman and Jane talked about it. But in terms of actual, I would say, tech clusters, I would highlight four. Four innovation tech clusters that are leading the way in the MENA region or have the potential to do so. And this is according to the World Economic Forum. So one of them is Algeria. Algeria is a very interesting country, and it wasn't when I was doing some homework around this, it wasn't one of the first one on my mind, but the Algerian government has done in the past 8 years a lot of taking a risk in terms of changing the regulation around the government regulation and the government regulation framework around improving the telecom industry in the region. And what we've seen is that the monopoly has gone down, of course, in Algeria, and has definitely improved the telecom industry and reduced the gap that it had with other and more advanced economies. And that led to have a very high mobile penetration rate, which is 30%, which is the highest in the Arab region. Imagine Algeria, which is followed by Egypt. And of course, that means that 30% of the population have access to mobile phone and are using mobile phone. And that, of course, opens a whole new world of opportunities to the UK's creative industries, where it could develop together with the local ecosystem online platforms that don't exist today. There is a gap today in Algeria and other Arab countries in content that is available in their native country. So definitely there's ways to develop together online platforms in healthcare, e-commerce, education, finance, and more, very similar to what we've done in Israel. Also, Morocco. Morocco is a very interesting country. For the first time in 10 years as well, Morocco has managed to attract multinationals to come to Morocco and set up some of their supply chains there. And that happened as a result of import incentives that it provided for multinationals. So we have actual advanced manufacturers now are setting up some of their supply chain operations there, from aerospace and car manufacturers. And of course, in no time, that will help stimulate the local talent, as it happened in Israel. So there's definitely things that the UK could look at there. And of course, Bahrain. Bahrain was mentioned a lot today. Bahrain is putting a lot of investment in order to position itself as a leading tech cluster in the region, especially in fintech and GovTech. It took to itself, Bahrain, the responsibility to improve the outdated finance sector in the MENA region and to embrace innovation and to cultivate a fintech community. I'm not sure, I'm sure they have big plans, but I definitely think that there's a way here for the financial institutions in the UK to link up. It's also deploying very innovative regulation around the use of cloud in government services, something that no other government has done before in the MENA region. And the fourth tech cluster, which I assume a lot of you, are familiar with, is the UAE. So it's been leading. It's been a leading player in the region for a while now. It has a strong ecosystem compared to the others. It has multinationals operating that. It has a mature investment community, and it's been nurturing unicorns as companies that are beyond the £1 billion dollar value. So that's in no time, because the startup scene has started only 10 years ago. So we've already, as Iman mentioned, we've already seen acquisitions happening by American companies and American investors for leading startups from that region. So we've seen Souk.com being acquired by Amazon, the same for Uber and Careem. We've seen also a big success of Anghami. Anghami is a music platform that, despite the investments that Spotify has put in the region, it's still considered the number one. So there's a lot of things that there's a lot of successes that are happening in this area, and these specific investment happened because of some of the investors that invested in this is because of the outward investment policy that the US had that encouraged these investors to go to the region and look at this region and invest in them. So it didn't happen. So definitely a government can play a role in this. So of course we can look at this from a one-dimensional way and think that the UK could look at these the tech clusters and develop tech hubs and develop tech ties. But I would say that you can't deny that Israel is around the corner, and Israel is one of the strongest tech players in the world that is shaping the face of tech in the world. And I think if you want to play it right, and if the UK wants to offer a long-lasting proposition, it needs to consider that, and it could definitely adapt new ways of digital strategies and commercial diplomacy in order to find these three-way ventures between the UK, the Arab world, and Israel, and to help shape the economy and the trade environment in the region where politics failed. So that's it for me for now.